Hello, everyone. My name is Robin Gailunas. I am going to be talking about American history today. You might notice that I'm dressed up as a historical character, and I'll tell you a little bit about who I'm dressed up as we go on. I'm going to give just a couple of minutes for everybody to start logging on. A couple of quick reminders. If you're new, or new information if you're new to this, is that in this webinar, we use the Q&A function and not the chat function. So if you have a question or you want to say something or you don't understand what I'm saying, then you just type something into the Q&A box. You might also see that there's something called like raise your hand, but we're not using that function in this webinar. We're just going to use the Q&A box. Okay, great. Well, it looks like most of you guys have joined us. So just as a bit of introduction, my name is Robin Gailunas, for those of you that weren't here right at the beginning. I'm a Delphian teacher, but most importantly, I love history. I love to read about it. I love to talk about it. I love to watch movies about it. And I know not everybody's as excited about history as I am, but I hope I can help you get a little more excited about it through this webinar. Okay. Hi, Holly. And yes, Mitchell, I am Rosie the Riveter. Good guess. Good. Hi, you guys. Thank you for saying hello and joining my webinar. Okay, so we're going to get started. I'm going to put up a slideshow that I made up on the screen. Okay, American history. What use is it? Just one second. Okay, the word history has two general meanings. It can mean everything that happened in the past, but it can also mean the record of what happened in the past. It's someone's story of past events. Maybe they write it down, or maybe they tell it as a story to someone else. It can also be the story that's passed from older generations to younger generations. When we talk about the history of America, or the history of Oregon, or the history of another place, we usually mean the kind of history that's written down. I see I have some more questions. I see some people wrote into the chats. Please make sure if you wanna ask a question that you type into the Q&A function. I'm gonna open some of those up just to see what questions you guys have. Thank you, Gayatri, for reminding me how to say your name. I appreciate it. Oh, Shane, I'm so glad that you love history. I really love history too. Hi, Sophie. Thanks for joining my webinar. Okay, great. And Elijah, I'm so glad you're loving this. Okay, good. So, and Gayatri, I'm glad you love history too. Okay, good. So, oh, good. We're going to go back. Sorry about that. We're going to go back to my slideshow. Okay, so what is history good for? History is full of great stories that are interesting and can be fun to read. I like to read about history because a lot of it is great people who were tough and determined, and they never gave up on what they believed in. These are people who really changed history for the better, and there's some really good examples for us. Now, there's tons of people that fall into that category, but when I think of people like that, I think of Martin Luther King Jr., Abraham Lincoln, Elizabeth Blackwell, who was actually the first woman to become a doctor in the United States, Anne Frank, Harriet Tubman, and Thomas Jefferson. So that was my first reason of why I think it's important to study history. Now you're probably wondered why I'm dressed this way. I'm not dressed as one person from history, but kind of a character that represents a lot of women in a specific time in history. And this character's name is Rosie the Riveter. Sorry, just one second. So for those of you that don't know, a rivet is a type of metal pin that that is used to hold sheets of metal together. So like you can see the picture to the left, I think that's an airplane. And the picture to the right is the rivet. So there's a hole in those two pieces of metal. The pin is the rivet that gets put between those. And then there's like a hammer or a gun that hits that pin and it expands, and that holds the sheet of metal together. So that's what a riveter is, a person who does that job. Abel, I see sometimes history is hard for you. It's true, it can be kind of hard, but I'm hoping that with some of this information and some of the tips I'm going to talk about, that it might help make it a little bit easier. Yeah, and Henry, I do think there's people who only recognize famous people known in their country. I mean, a lot of people study the history of their own country first before they study the history of other countries. Gayatri, I did teach Earth geography, yes. And Sarah, yes, you're right. She is the woman that holds her arm up as if she were showing off her muscles, which is actually the picture I'm going to show you guys next. Okay, so here, this is that exact picture that Sarah was talking about. So this is Rosie the Riveter. She was a character that was shown on a poster. This thing that you can see here is actually a poster that was created by a company called Westinghouse Electric. They made things like big engines that ran on steam and gasoline. And the reason they made this poster was to encourage more women to work in the factories to help the war effort during World War II. I have a picture of a real life riveter that will come next. And Krish, I'm not going to teach about slavery in this one because I'm just sort of talking about the importance of history, but there may be one in the future where I'm going to talk about the Civil War and things like that. Let's see if there's any other questions. Hold on one second. Oh, Violet, I'm glad you saw a TV program about her. Yeah, she's a really cool character and stood for some really nice, you know, important women. Amelie, how the factories helped were in American factories during World War II, they made things like planes, tanks, some made ammunition that went in the guns, some even made bombs and ships even. And so these women worked in these different factories doing these jobs. Thanks for asking that question. That's a great question, Amelie. Alette, I hope I said your name right. She was based on a real person, but Rosie the Riveter herself wasn't a real person. There's many different stories about who she actually was, but she was one of the many women who worked in the factories, and she was modeled off of her. Hi, Violet and Penelope. So glad you guys could join my webinar. I'm happy to have you guys here. Okay, good. Henry, the information that I had was that it was Westinghouse Electric. It's possible that it was also used for Lockheed Martin. There were many drawings that were similar to this that promoted women working in factories. Okay, great. I'm going to show you guys the next thing, which this is a picture of a woman, a real life riveter. So this woman was working in a plane factory in Nashville, Tennessee, and you can see the rivets there, and the drill that's in her hand is the drill that she's using to hit the different pins. So that's an example of a woman who's a riveter. So why do I think Rosie the Riveter is interesting or brave or determined, which would fit into those different categories that I mentioned in my first one of why history is important, is these women, they took these jobs in factories to build airplanes, ships, tanks, bombs, and other things that the United States needed in World War II, even though they didn't have any experience. And many of them had been stay-at-home moms before that, staying home, taking care of their kids. Not only were they brave to try something new, it actually wasn't that common for women before World War II to have a job outside of the house. And if they did, they were a teacher or a secretary or something like that. And the reason that they needed these women to work in the factories is because a lot of the men went off to fight in World War II. So jobs that were men's jobs, originally, they didn't have anybody to do them. So they asked these women to help, and they did. And during World War II, there were about 6 million women who worked in that time. So that is a lot of jobs, a lot of women. Let's see, I have a couple of questions here. Let me see if I can answer them. Andrew says, what year did she become a riveter? This poster was created in the early 1940s. So I've seen a couple of sources that say 1941 or 1942, so it was right about that time. McKenna, that's so cool that your friend's grandma did that. That's really, really an awesome thing. And yes, Abel, rivets are kind of like nails, but you hit them really hard and then they kind of expand and it holds the metal together. Yes, Henry, you're right. They helped their country in one of the worst times, if not the worst time in that part of history. So they were really important women. Amelie, yes, they did get paid for working in the factories. So that was good as well. Let's just see if there's a couple other. Oh, Abigail, it's okay for being late. A riveter is a woman or a person whose job is to stick these little pins between sheets of metal, like on a plane or a tank, and then they hit them and it expands, and it's kind of like a nail that holds it together. Andrew, I haven't met a riveter in real life, but I would really love to because I think the job they did was really important and I admire them a lot. Arabella asked, did the women keep their jobs after the men came back? Really, some women kept their jobs, but a lot of them ended up not having a job anymore because the jobs went to the men when they returned from war. So that was also hard for those women to have to do, to spend so many years being productive and helpful and having a job outside the house and then have to give up those jobs. Mark asks, were they discriminated against? Some of them were, just because some of the men in the factories maybe didn't want women doing the same jobs that they did. Surintha asks if they all wore the same uniform that Rosie's wearing. A lot of them did. And this outfit that I'm wearing, it's called coveralls. And I think it gets that name because it covers all of your self. And you could wear clothes underneath it and it would cover that. And it was just a way to keep their other clothes clean. Okay, you guys have a lot of great questions. Abel asked, if the women did not work in the jobs, would we have won World War II? I would have to say, though I'm not an expert on that, that probably not, because the planes that the pilots flew and the bombs that got dropped and many, many things that were used wouldn't have existed without these women, or not as many of them would have existed without these women. Penelope asked, did they enjoy it, or was it just for the purpose of helping the country? Well, it's hard to say. I think they probably did it first for the purpose, I would imagine, did it first for the purpose of helping their country. But anytime, if you guys have ever done a job or been given a job and you do it, it does feel good to be able to do it. So I'm sure they did enjoy it. Okay, great. I'm going to show the next one. You guys are having so many great questions. I am afraid I may not be able to get to them all, but I will try. Okay, let's see. What's my next picture here? Here's another picture of a woman. This woman is working on an airplane motor for the Northern American Aviation Incorporated plant in Inglewood, California, which is by Los Angeles. And these women are actually working on a ship that was being built in California. Okay, great. So that's a little bit about Rosie the Riveter and why I think she's important and why I picked her as my first person to dress up as. Let's see if I can get to a couple more questions. Mark asked, were the women able to vote? Yes, they were able to vote. And Aiden asked, did they get paid a fair amount? Yes, I think they probably got paid a fair amount. The factories and the United States needed those women to work because they needed the things that they were helping create. Okay, great. Let me just... Mark says they all look like Rosie. It's true. I think the reason that whoever drew that poster drew it that way is because the vast majority of women who worked in the factories looked like Rosie. They wore a handkerchief over their hair, probably, I imagine, to keep their hair clean, because the factories probably were a little dirty. And because then if there were moving parts or machines or things like that, it would keep their hair safe. You would not want to be doing something and have your hair yanked. That would be bad. Henry, I'm not sure if any other countries use riveters, though I'm sure that they did if they had airplane plants or ship plants or different places that built things for the war effort. I do know Canada did, because I saw a special on TV about women who worked in Canadian factories. Okay, great. Good. So that's a little bit about why I chose Rosie. I'm glad that I was able to share something about her and the women who worked in World War II. Now we're going to go to the next thing that history is good for. I think it's possible, and it's okay if you disagree with the reasons what I think history is good for, and maybe you can even think up some reasons it's good yourself too, and I'd love to hear them if you do. It's also useful to know in history something about where you live, your country, and the world. If you and all your friends understand your history, you can understand each other better. You can also understand many other things better, like why people look or act differently, why they like certain things or places, and this can help you be more successful in life. Okay, so many students, when they study history, they tell me that it's hard to know what's important in history. And when you study history, it's a lot of events and people and dates, and it can feel like it's hard to know what's more important than what other things. So there's no exact way that I can tell you like this is important and this is not important, but because you kind of have to figure that out for yourself, but I have some tips for you. Hold on 1 second. Let me just see. Elijah asked if women did other jobs, and I do think they did other jobs to help the war effort, but a lot of them worked in factories. Hope that answers your question. And yes, history is good for knowing about your ancestors and what major events happened back then. That's totally right. And Mark says, I think history is good so people don't make the same mistakes or do the same actions. And I would agree. Okay, great. So here are my tips for deciding what's important in history. Tip number 1, when you study history, pay attention to people who are strong enough to make things happen. So for instance, you know, sometimes the strong people in history are leaders, and sometimes they're just ordinary people who don't give up and just get a job done. For example, when Americans were fighting for independence from England, George Washington was the general of the American army. He was a really good general, but many times he and his army were almost defeated, but he never gave up, even when it was hard, even when he didn't have money to pay his soldiers, or he didn't have enough food, or it was really cold and they didn't have shoes. He just kept going because he really believed in what he was fighting for. And also the soldiers, it was not always easy to fight in the Revolutionary War. And because sometimes they didn't have enough money to buy supplies or have food or shoes, or they were stuck in a really cold winter, many people gave up and left the army and went home to farm or do the other things that they had done before. But there were some soldiers who didn't leave and who stayed with General Washington and fought until the end. It's interesting to note, but a large part of General Washington's army were actually teenagers at that time. There were adults, but there were also a lot of teenagers who were fighting for him. So if it wasn't for those soldiers, those ordinary men who didn't give up and just got the job done, and General Washington, who was a strong leader and just got done what he needed to get done, it is possible that the United States wouldn't have won the war against Britain. So that would be a good example of paying attention to people who are strong enough to make things happen. Let me just see if I can answer some questions. You guys have a lot of questions about riveters. And I would suggest, if you want to find out more about them, you could definitely do some more research on them. I found a lot of things just by Googling it or looking it up in some different encyclopedias. Arabella asked, did they choose to go to the army or were they forced? So during the Revolutionary War, I believe they had a choice to go. They fought because they wanted to. But once they agreed to fight for the army, they were required to stay there for a certain amount of time. So kind of once they said they wanted to do it, they had to keep going. I hope that answers your question. John, I see you raised your hand. If you can type your question into the Q&A box, I'll be happy to try to answer it. Mark asked, did George Washington stay with them on the battlefield? Many times I believe he did stay with them on the battlefield. Sometimes he would have to be at the back, but he was definitely there for his men. Abel says he likes timelines about history. Yep, me too. Okay, good. Oh, John, you asked, what year was Rosie created? I think she was created in the early 1940s. So I've read things where it was 1941 and I've read things where it was 1942 or maybe even 1943. So definitely in the early 1940s. Okay, great, good. Sorry guys, I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties. I apologize. If you just hang in with me. Holly, I just saw your question. We're gonna end, I think, at noon. Okay, great. So that's tip number one. Okay, so the next tip is learn a few important events and dates and be able to tell why you think they're important. So that's my second tip for figuring out what's important in history. And so I'll give you guys an example of that. Hold on just 1 second, so sorry. Okay, so events and dates can be really useful if they help you understand things that happened around the same time and how they fit together. Yes, you're right, Amelie, this is what you learn in elementary history. And Brittany, I hope that I'm gonna continue to dress up like people that are important because I love to dress up and I love history and it seems to be the perfect combination. Okay, and Andrew asked, did women fight with the men on the battlefield? I do believe there were some women who fought on the battlefield. There's a very famous story that I remember reading about a girl named Molly Pitcher whose job was to bring water to the soldiers on the Revolutionary War battlefield. Okay, good. Okay, so back to tip number 2, learn a few important events and dates to be able to tell why you think they're important. So most people who know about American history know that July 4th, 1776 is the birthday of the United States. That's the date that the Declaration of Independence was signed, and that the men who created the Declaration of Independence and signed it decided that the 13 colonies would no longer be part of England and that they were going to declare themselves independent. That's why it's the Declaration of Independence. So knowing that date helps you to sort of better understand what's happening around that time. So for instance, did you know that on July 4th, 1776, George Washington and his American troops had already been fighting against the English for over a year? and that the war would go on for 5 more years after that. So that can help you kind of see how those two things fit together. If there hadn't been the Declaration of Independence, if there hadn't been George Washington, if there hadn't been, you know, people deciding they wanted to be independent, it might have taken the United States a lot longer to become free from England, or it might not have happened. So those are just some ways that you can kind of see events and dates and how things happen and how they might be connected. Okay, let's see. I think I have some more questions here. Let ask, can I dress up like George Washington? I'm gonna look at what costumes I have in my costume place and see if I can dress up as George Washington. If I can't dress up as George Washington, I might dress up as George Washington's wife. Krish, I'm sorry I didn't see your earlier question. If you want to ask me again, just type it in again and I'll answer it. Abel says, do you have to memorize dates? My suggestion about memorizing dates is there are a few dates that it's important to memorize, like July 4th, 1776. It was the birthday of the United States. And hopefully that's one of the things that I can cover, probably not in this one, but in later ones, how to kind of know what dates are important. So hopefully that answers your question. John Newell asked, didn't Thomas Jefferson also die on July 4th? Yes, he actually did. And so did John Adams. They died on the same day. Krish asks, do women have the same rights as men? If so, why do women get paid less? Well, that's a tough question to answer, truthfully. And I don't really know the answer of why they get paid less than men. I don't have a good answer to that, Krish. I'm sorry. No, that probably wasn't very much help. But I agree, it's unfair. Abel, yes, I agree. It is kind of hard to memorize dates. And so I think it's important to kind of pick a few and then you can practice memorizing those ones. Andrew asked, did George do a sneak attack on the British on Christmas Day? Yes, he did. He actually crossed the Delaware on Christmas Day with his men. The river was somewhat frozen. He planned to do it on Christmas Day because he knew the soldiers on the other side had been sort of partying the night before and that they'd be sleeping. There's actually a really amazing painting, maybe one of my favorite American history paintings, called Washington Crosses the Delaware. I recommend you look it up if you haven't seen it or if you're not familiar with it. It's a really, really beautiful painting. The thing to know also, which you won't see from pictures, is that it's huge. It's on display in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and it takes up this huge wall. So when you look at it, just imagine the biggest painting you've ever seen, and that is it. Abigail asks, were women well appreciated? In World War II, definitely. I mean, I think for men who are fighting wars and doing hard things, they definitely appreciate the women around them helping them. And Sarah asked, did men respect the women after what they did? Yes, I think they did. And Mark asked, do you know about the Boston Tea Party? Yes, I do. And I think my next one is actually going to be on Revolutionary history. So I think we'll talk about that in the next one. Srinath, hope I said your name right. Yes, your class had a painting of that in the classrooms. That's really, really cool. Okay, great. So let's do my next tip. Okay, so my next tip is Tip number 3, learn from the successes and mistakes of people you study in history. I'm going to keep using George Washington as an example, though there are many, many people that are considered successful in American history and in world history. So when you're studying history, it really helps to pay attention to the things that worked really well and the things that were disasters or didn't work really well. For instance, George Washington was the general of the American Army, and he was also the first president of the United States. He was very successful at both things. So it would be helpful to study, you could study George Washington and find out what made him such a good leader. How did he become a good leader? How was he able to do these things? What made him good at the things that he did? And that would be a great way to learn more about the successful things in history. On the other hand, until right before the Revolutionary War, many colonists living in the 13 colonies considered themselves, if they were from England, to be loyal to the King of England. They considered themselves to be British subjects. But then different things happened, and the king passed certain laws and did different things, which we'll talk about at a later one. But in a shortish amount of time, these people who considered themselves very loyal to the king decided that they no longer wanted to belong to England, that they wanted to be part of their own country. And so if you know why, or if you look at and study why those things happened, it can give you a little bit of an idea of maybe what King George could have done differently. Or if he had had a better relationship with the colonists and maybe done some things differently, maybe war wouldn't have had to happen. So that's a good example of how you could learn from the mistakes of the people when you study history. Okay, great. Well, let's look at some questions. You guys are doing great with the questions. I am not sure if George Washington had any pets, though I am sure he probably had horses. And, you know, he actually, Mount Vernon was the name of his home, and I think it was a farm. So I think it's probably pretty safe to assume that he did have pets of some kind, or definitely animals. Penelope says she saw a movie where this guy recreated the Delaware painting with women in the boat and that it was really awesome. That does sound really awesome. I'm going to look that up as soon as I'm done here. Okay, great. Let's just see if there's any other questions. Were they called loyalists? Andrew asks. Yes, the loyalists were the people, so not in the 13 colonies, once the Declaration of Independence was written, not everybody agreed with becoming independent from England. And the people who lived in what is in the United States who wanted to stay a part of England were called loyalists because they were loyal to the king. Great. Well, many of you are confirming for me through your answers that George Washington had pets. So thank you for teaching me something new as well. Elijah asks, why were horses so important? Well, at that time, there were no cars. So if you wanted to go somewhere, you had to ride on a horse, or they would hook up horses to wagons. And that's how they would carry people and things. Also, they had to farm, and some of them had a lot of land, and they used the horses to farm that land. Okay, good. I think, let me just see. Wonderful. I'll just see if there's a last couple questions. We are almost out of time. McKenna says, I read George Washington didn't want to be president. He wanted to be a farmer. I don't know if I think that that's true. He liked to live a quiet life. He liked to not be the center of attention. And actually, an interesting thing about George Washington was one of the ideas originally was to make him a king, to have a king of America. And George Washington was like, nope, he did not want to be the king. He felt really strongly that they had fought a war to be free of a king, and what they needed was something new and something different. And that was something he really believed in. So I think that's all the time I have right now. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you learned something about history. I hope you got some good ideas of maybe things you could do differently when you study history, or if you already love history, that you got some ideas of things that could increase your love of history. So thank you so much for joining me. I had a really great time. You guys asked super great questions and really thoughtful things, and thank you so much. I'm gonna be doing one tomorrow, so that if you're interested in finding out more, you can sign up for my webinar. And we have a lot of other different webinars, things about first aid and emergency, math, all different kinds of things. So if you are interested in doing anything else, please check it out. Okay, thank you very much.